In the early years of the 20th century, the Russian Empire stood as a colossus, sprawling across 2 continents and covering about 1/6 of the Earth's landmass. It was a realm of immense contrasts, a world of glittering palaces and profound poverty, of vast, silent forests and bustling, overcrowded cities. At its head was Tsar Nicholas II, an autocrat who believed he ruled by divine right, the latest in a long line of Romanov monarchs. His power seemed absolute, his authority unquestioned by the millions who toiled in the fields and factories. Yet beneath this veneer of stability, the foundations of this ancient empire were beginning to crack under immense pressure, threatening to shatter a world that had stood for centuries. The defeat in the Far East brought the simmering unrest to a boil, culminating in the revolution of 1905. It began when a peaceful procession of workers, led by a priest named Father Gapon, marched to the Winter Palace. The response was not dialogue, but bullets. Troops opened fire on the unarmed crowd in an event that became known as Bloody Sunday. The massacre shattered the people's age-old faith in the Tsar as a benevolent protector, revealing the brutal reality of the autocratic state. The shock sparked a wave of strikes, peasant uprisings and military mutinies. Forced to make concessions, the Tsar issued his October Manifesto, promising civil liberties and an elected parliament, the Duma. The experience was a dress rehearsal for revolution, providing invaluable lessons for radical parties, particularly the Bolsheviks, led by Vladimir Lenin. His ideas were smuggled into Russia, patiently cultivating a dedicated following and laying the ideological groundwork for a future confrontation. The final fatal blow to the Tsarist regime came with the outbreak of the First World War in 1914. But this unity quickly evaporated. The Russian army, though vast, was poorly equipped and badly led. Soldiers were sent to the front without adequate weapons, suffering catastrophic losses against the well-organized German army. The conscription of millions of peasants led to widespread food shortages in the cities. With the Tsar away at military headquarters, he left the country in the hands of his German-born wife, Tsarina Alexandra. She, in turn, fell under the influence of the mystic Grigory Rasputin, a controversial figure who discredited the monarchy. By the winter of 1916 to 1917, the Russian Empire was on the verge of total collapse. The final chapter began in the bitter cold of February. On International Women's Day, thousands of female textile workers, weary of standing for hours for bread, walked out of their factories. Their protest was a spark that ignited a firestorm. Their chants evolved from "We want bread" to "Down with the autocracy." But this time was different. The soldiers, weary of the war, were reluctant to fire. Instead of suppressing the uprising, the soldiers joined it. Advised by his generals that the army would no longer support him, Tsar Nicholas II finally relented, signing the document that ended over 300 years of Romanov rule. The Russian Empire had ceased to exist. With the Tsar gone, a political vacuum emerged. 2 rival institutions arose, both claiming to represent the will of the people. The first was the Provisional Government, formed by the old Duma, dominated by moderate liberals and aristocrats. At the same time, the Petrograd Soviet of Workers' and Soldiers' Deputies was re-established, a more direct and radical form of democracy. This unique situation created a system of dual power, an uneasy and unstable arrangement where 2 governments coexisted and competed for control. Into this volatile atmosphere, a decisive element was introduced. In April 1917, Vladimir Lenin returned to Russia. He immediately stunned his own party by delivering a fiery speech that rejected any cooperation with the provisional government. His message was simple, direct, and powerful, encapsulated in slogans that resonated deeply with the masses: peace, land, and bread, and all power to the Soviets. The growing frustration boiled over in July. Spontaneous armed demonstrations erupted, demanding the Soviet take power, but the uprising was suppressed. In late August, the new commander-in-chief, General Kornilov, ordered his troops to march on Petrograd, intending to establish a military dictatorship. A terrified Kerensky, with no reliable troops of his own, was forced to turn for help to the very group he had been suppressing, the Bolsheviks. The Bolsheviks seized the opportunity. Their Red Guards were released from prison and armed to defend the revolution. Railway workers sabotaged the tracks, and Bolshevik agitators persuaded the soldiers not to fight. The coup collapsed without a single shot being fired in the capital. The Bolsheviks emerged as the heroes of the hour. Their popularity soared, and they now commanded majorities in the key Petrograd and Moscow Soviets. Lenin, still in hiding, became convinced the time for waiting was over, passionately urging an immediate armed uprising. The organizational genius of Leon Trotsky, chairman of the Petrograd Soviet, won the day. He established the Military Revolutionary Committee to plan the insurrection. The insurrection began on the night of October 24th. It was a series of carefully coordinated tactical maneuvers with little resistance. The final act was the seizure of the Winter Palace. After a blank shot was fired from the cruiser Aurora, the remaining defenders gave up. On the same evening, Trotsky was able to stand before the Congress of Soviets and declare triumphantly, "The provisional government has ceased to exist." With power secured, Lenin emerged from hiding and presented a series of decrees to fulfill the promises that had brought the Bolsheviks to power. The first was the Decree on Peace. It called for an immediate end to the war, proposing negotiations for a just, democratic peace. The second was the Decree on Land. This decree abolished all private ownership of land, handing the vast estates of the nobility over to the peasants. They also affirmed the right of nations to self-determination, including the right to secede, a radical departure from the forced Russification policies of the past. The swift dissolution of the Constituent Assembly, in which the Bolsheviks had failed to win a majority, signaled their intention to rule alone. This political opposition soon coalesced into armed resistance. Across the country, anti-Bolshevik forces began to organize. The Bolsheviks controlled the industrial heartland, while the Whites held sway over the peripheries, each front representing a grave threat to the fledgling Soviet state. The conflict was further complicated as the collapse of the empire unleashed powerful nationalist movements, creating a chaotic, multi-sided war. The Russian Civil War was a conflict of extreme brutality. Under the ruthless leadership of Leon Trotsky, the Red Army was forged into a formidable fighting machine. The Bolsheviks implemented war communism, including the forced requisition of grain from the peasantry to feed the army and the cities. The White armies, in contrast, were beset by internal divisions and a lack of a unifying vision for the future of Russia. The war was characterized by immense cruelty. Both the Red Terror and the White Terror saw brutal reprisals against civilian populations. Ultimately, the Bolshevik strengths proved decisive. By the end of 1920, the main white forces had been crushed. The struggle was not simply two-sided. A third force, known as the Greens, emerged, peasant armies who fought to defend their villages from both sides. One of the most significant movements was the anarchist Black Army in Ukraine, led by Nestor Makhno, who fought heroically against the Whites. The chaos also drew in foreign powers. Britain, France, Japan and the United States sent troops to intervene on behalf of the White armies. However, the intervention was half-hearted and allowed the Bolsheviks to portray themselves as patriotic defenders of the motherland. With the war won, the country was in ruins. The most dramatic challenge came in March 1921, when the sailors at Kronstadt rose in rebellion. The rebellion was crushed, but the message was clear. In response, Lenin announced a strategic retreat known as the New Economic Policy, or NEP. It ended forced grain seizure and permitted small-scale private enterprise. Food began to reappear in the cities, and the economies slowly began to stabilize. This period of economic liberalization provided the stability required for the Bolsheviks to turn to another monumental task: formalizing the political structure of the new state. By 1922, several independent Soviet socialist republics had been set up, but their political status was uncertain. A fierce debate broke out. Joseph Stalin, the Commissar for Nationalities, proposed an autonomization plan, where other republics would be absorbed into Russia. But Lenin, increasingly sidelined by illness, strongly opposed this. He worried it smacked of the same imperial arrogance the Bolsheviks had fought to overthrow. Lenin proposed creating an entirely new federal entity, the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics. Russia, Ukraine, Belarus, and the Transcaucasian Federation would join as equal founding members. Lenin's authority was still immense, and his view won out over Stalin's. Throughout the latter half of 1922, delegations met to draft the foundational documents, ironing out the distribution of powers. The culmination came on December 30th, 1922. At a grand ceremony in Moscow, representatives gathered for the first All-Union Congress of Soviets. Here they formally approved and signed the Treaty on the Creation of the USSR. This moment marked the official birth of the Soviet Union, a new and unprecedented political entity on the world map. However, beneath this elaborate federal facade lay a very different reality. The true nervous system of the new state was the highly centralized Communist Party. This allowed a dual policy, promoting indigenous languages and cultures to win loyalty, while ensuring unwavering political control from the center, crushing any genuine dissent. The Soviet Union was thus a state held together by a unique blend of constitutional promises and brute political reality, a tension that would shape its entire history. The most significant event of this period was the power struggle that erupted within the Communist Party following Lenin's death in January 1924. Joseph Stalin, the unassuming but politically cunning General Secretary, masterfully outmaneuvered all his rivals. By the late 1920s, Stalin had emerged as the undisputed dictator of the Soviet Union. He was preparing to launch a new revolution from above, involving the forced collectivization of agriculture and a crash program of rapid industrialization. The birth of the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics was not merely the creation of a new country, it was the dawn of a new era. For the next 7 decades, world history would be defined by the ideological struggle between this new communist state and the capitalist West. The Union's history would be one of immense contradictions, of unprecedented social mobility and brutal repression, of scientific achievement and devastating famine. The story of its formation is a powerful reminder of how quickly established orders can crumble and how radical ideas can, for better or for worse, reshape human history. Thank you for joining us on this journey into the past. If you found this exploration of history engaging, please consider liking this video and subscribing to our channel for more deep dives into the events that shaped our world.